If you'd like to come tonight, I don't think there's any tickets left. It's sold out, but there's a chance that people may not show up, so you may get a space. But just to give you a heads up there. And then there's a put the music here. There's an event tomorrow night with poet and writer Haki Madhubuti, who is wrote a book. It's an anthology. It's called For Gaza's Children. It's written by Arab, Muslim, Israeli, Jewish, and others. It's an anthology. It's supposed to be very good. I haven't seen the book yet, but he'll be here tomorrow night to sign and talk. So you're welcome to come to that. There's lots of events happening. Please go to the website, busboysoppose.com. You'll see events that are upcoming. We have at least 3 or 4 events a week that are related to Palestine and Gaza, because we feel this is a very important subject right now that we have to continue to push for and continue to raise awareness about. Any comments, questions? This series we started, this is our 4th in a series that will continue. This is a series that we thought would be useful. A lot of people go to church on Sundays, and we figured this is an alternative to church. Not that we have anything against the church, but this is just an alternative for people who want to come out on Sunday morning where parking is easy and traffic is easy as well, to be here to learn about some big topics. The first one we started with was on Palestine. The second one was on Syria. The third one was on Russia. This one is on Iran. The next one will be on Islam, which will be March 2nd, which will be the second day of Ramadan. So that's in the morning as well. And then the next one will be, we're still trying to find a topic for that right now, but we're looking for possibly China, on China, or on the use of AI in warfare. And the one after that is going to be on Zionism. So lots of big topics like that. This is a lecture type of environment where we have somebody that we feel is an expert in the topic. Hello, Negar. How are you? Good to see you. Welcome, welcome. That will be lecturing, basically. This is not a debate. It's not a conversation, but more of a lecture style program. So this is like a school. We'll have time for the speaker to speak, and then take some questions at the end, and then everybody can be on their merry way. So any upcoming events, things like that, I'm going to turn over the microphone to Medea Benjamin, who she and I are the ones that came up with this idea, and I'll let her introduce our speaker as well, but also make some announcements of upcoming things.
Good morning. Let's see, we also have here at Busboys, Andy, you have Phyllis Bennis on Tuesday, right?
That's right.
Yeah, Phyllis Bennis, if you don't know, a wonderful writer from the Institute for Policy Studies. She's got a great new book on Gaza, Palestine. Understanding Palestine and Israel. So she'll be doing a talk and a book signing. We know we have a couple of stalwarts here who go to Congress with us on a regular basis. Thank you very much for that. And anybody who wants to join that, there's going to be a lot happening this coming week. We're there on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. If you want to join us, you can see me and I can put you in our WhatsApp group. Other things that are going around, well, there's some new actions that will be starting up next week. Actually, I think not supposed to talk about them until they happen, so I won't announce. Let's see, today's the last Sunday of a wonderful pop-up that happens on Sunday afternoons, starting at 1 o'clock, 1 till 5. And it's really fun. It's at a location on Kansas. I can give you the address if you're interested, but it's good food and music and a very intergenerational atmosphere. There's art for kids, there's henna, there's tattoos. If you've always wanted a tattoo of Palestine on your whatever, you can come and get one. So those are some of the things coming up. So Andy, we usually start at 9:30. Do we want to start right now?
Yes, just one other comment. Ramadan starts on Saturday, I believe, the 1st. So we are hosting a sahur. A sahur, for those of you that may not know, is a meal that's eaten in the middle of the night so that it prepares you for the fast the next day. The sahur we're having is from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. There will be a Columbia transport poets location. And then there'll be opening special for that, for the 2 hours of the Howard County Muslim Association of Groups, something like that, is basically hosting that. So anyone that wants to experience that kind of really cool, that kind of interesting cultural experience. We also will be doing some iftars, where the iftars are where you break the fast at the end of the day, which usually, I think this time of year happens around 5:30, 6 o'clock in the evening at sunset. I think we can start. Any questions? Anybody else want to make any comments or things that are coming? Anything happening, Sam, in your world? You haven't been dragged out or arrested lately? No, okay.
Okay, so yes, we're going to start then. And today's lecture will be on Iran. Who here is Iranian? Wow. Who here is married to an Iranian? Who's been to Iran? Wow. Okay, so Negar, we've got a lot of people who came here because they care about Iran and they're interested in Iran. And obviously, the U.S. has had a very conflictive relationship with Iran, and we don't know where this is going. So it's very important to talk about this, and we're very excited about our speaker this morning, who is Negar Mortazavi, who is somebody that I have always looked to for a long time when I have questions on Iran about how to interpret this issue, how to interpret that issue. She is brilliant, an award-winning journalist who is a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, non-resident scholar at the Middle East Policy Council, editor and host of the Iran podcast, which is a fabulous podcast to learn what is happening every week around Iran. And she does a beautiful, beautiful job on it. She's appeared on CNN, NBC, NPR, BBC, France 24, Al Jazeera, among others. She's written for Foreign Policy Magazine, Politico, The Intercept, and The Independent. She was previously a television host for Voice of America, which is probably losing its funding now, right? Isn't that AID funded?
We don't know today.
Maybe tomorrow. Washington correspondent for Iran International Television, and a diplomatic correspondent for The Independent. So let's give a round of applause for Negar. Thank you so much for coming out so early on a Sunday.
Thank you so much, Media, Andy, for organizing. This is my first time to one of these events, so I guess we'll create the format as we go. But it's great to be here, be back at Busboys, one of my favorite establishments or institutions. I would say it's really an institution, Andy, that you and Marjan have built in the city. And especially in the past year or two, the events have just been phenomenal, as always. But it's great to be back. And good morning. Thank you for being here, all of you, and for being interested in Iran and U.S.-Iran issues. Do I have to sit here, Andy? Can I? Yeah. Okay. Will you see me if I sit here or? Oh. Okay, it's just the stool is a little. No, it's just uncomfortable. Did nobody else ever complain? Ah, okay, all right. So I'll switch up. Um, so I can see all of you. Can everyone hear me? Okay, fantastic. So yeah, I guess. Well, first of all, when is not an important time to talk about Iran? I've come to realize in the past decade or so, really focusing and working on the issue here in U.S.-Iran relations, and also, along the way, understanding the lack of deep knowledge about the country, both within the American society, and even with the elite, policymakers, even journalists. And obviously access to the country is very difficult. So only 2 people here have traveled to the country, and vice versa also. On the other side, it's very difficult for Iranians to have access to the U.S. society. So I think I would call them 2 of the most misunderstood really countries and societies from each other's perspective, although less for Iranians because there is more exposure to America through cultural products, media, film, television, which Iranians, as rest of the world, follow a lot. So I would say an average Iranian's knowledge of the United States without having been here or ever meeting an American is much higher. Maybe Medea, you can also attest to that, having been to Iran, as opposed to what's here. But at the same time, it's a country of very high interest for U.S. policy, U.S. foreign policy. So I would say this balance has been very interesting for me, having worked on the country for over a decade. How much U.S. foreign policy, or essentially this town, the Beltway, is focused on this country that the rest of the America doesn't know about, or doesn't care as much about, or hasn't been to, or cares about for all the wrong reasons. Sometimes you forget that it's an actual country with 80 million people who go to school and go eat breakfast and go to cafes, just one nuclear program or a bunch of nuclear sites. So what I think I'll try to do in the next hour, is to shed some light, but I also don't have a very big lecture prepared, so I'd love to get some questions or even comments to understand where the room is at and where your questions are, how much background you have, so I don't repeat things you know, or I don't assume you know things that I didn't say. But anyway, so talking about U.S.-Iran relations, if I do a very quick overview, I think it's fair to go all the way back to the 1953 coup. Americans think Iranians hold a grudge whenever you talk about the coup, but the same is true for the hostage crisis. So I think it's fair to go all the way back to 1953, which would be the biggest highlight, and then we can start from that. So basically, Iran and the U.S. were very close allies. Iran was the closest, or one of America's closest allies in the region. This is during the reign of the last dynasty, the Pahlavi dynasty. And then came 1953. 1953, a CIA MI6 orchestrated coup in the country that toppled a very popular and democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, whose crime for the coup was to nationalize Iranian oil. Basically, he took the privilege that the British Petroleum had held before that, and he nationalized this natural resource for the Iranians to basically own and decide on how it should be spent. The British didn't like that, British Petroleum specifically, but also the British, so the MI6 and the CIA cooked up or orchestrated this coup in 1953. I believe it was the first successful CIA coup. I've heard later. Not very transparent, actually. This is another thing I'll add later. It took them a very long time to admit, and essentially calling Iranians crazy and delusional and paranoid for decades, saying that basically this was a popular uprising. It included thugs on the streets who were paid. It included smear pieces being published against the prime minister and his allies by authors and journalists and writers who were paid. It included, various different political and street elements to make it look like a popular uprising movement. And there's a famous Iranian saying from that era that says, people would say, long live Mossadegh today, and then death to Mossadegh tomorrow. So that's how the popular uprising really turned out, and then later it was understood that it was an actual coup, and it became successful, and it was used as a blueprint also here later by the CIA for successful coups in other places. And so the grudge on the Iranian side, I would say, starts there. That's when you have sort of an almost unified agreement, almost, I would say, because also the political elite are very divided, but on how America did Iran wrong. And Mossadegh wasn't a religious or Islamist fanatic, had nothing to do with this current system or regime. He was very popular, he was an intellectual, and he was, a person, an official within that system, within the court system, the Shah system, and still he wasn't tolerated. And so, I'm not a historian, but historians even would argue that that was sort of one of the foundations that led up and later culminated in what was the 1979 revolution. So we're talking 1953, which from the American perspective is ancient history. Why do you guys hold a grudge so long? But then it comes to 1979, which is the revolution. And before we get that, I want to explain what happened after the coup from that perspective. So the Shah was reinstated into power, led a very brutal ruling after the coup, leading up to 1979. Political prisoners, very notorious intelligence service, cracking down on dissent in universities and among the political elite. No free speech, no free press, no political freedoms, lots of social freedoms though. And we can talk about that later, because that's the irony is now the reverse has kind of happened in a way, or a different chapter has opened. But if you look at photos of the Iranian society, which a lot of supporters of that era like to point to, you see a sort of Western-looking, at least in urban areas, society with women in miniskirts and people with bikinis on the beach, and men and women mixing universities and all of that. So that sort of social freedom existed, but not so much political freedoms. And so 1979, essentially, the revolution came as a culmination of these years of the ruling of a monarch that was seen sort of propped up by the United States after that coup, and in a very brutal way. Revolution included, obviously, the Islamists and the supreme leader later, the leader of the revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, was the top person leading and in power, but it included leftists, student movements, labor unions, various different, political, secular movements in the country, even Jewish leftists. There's some history research done on that, good books, and really brought, I would say, most of the society and that sort of dissent to that ruling together, and brought 1979, which then is the other highlight or starting point of the falling out of Iran and the United States. But I just wanted to give that context because I feel like from the perspective in this country, history, U.S.-Iran history starts in 1979, and it doesn't from the other side. And so after 1979, obviously you all heard of the hostage crisis, a group of Iranian revolutionary students with massive, massive support, by the way, on the street and among the revolutionaries, and the sort of the populace stormed the U.S. embassy in fear of another coup being launched out of that same embassy, which helped the 1953. So. Not justifying, but just providing context. And so American diplomats were held hostage for a very long time. Every single day was counted by, I believe it was ABC News. And so that was essentially the real official starting point of the US and Iran's falling out, losing diplomatic relations or cutting diplomatic relations. A beautiful embassy here on Massachusetts Avenue, if you haven't been, has been closed since then. It's a really beautiful building. You should just go pass by it, right on Massachusetts Avenue. And a very important and large embassy it was all those years of the Shah, yes, with infamous parties. And the US and Iran don't have relations since then. You probably all know, no embassies, no diplomats, except for this is an exception because the U.S. is the host nation of the United Nations. Sometimes you may hear of Iranian diplomats in the U.S. They really are at the UN in New York, in UN territory, with a very special visa that only allows them to travel from basically JFK to their home in New York and to the UN mission. They're not diplomats to the United States. And so the US also doesn't have diplomats in Iran. They both just have what they call these interest sections, which in Washington is housed in a building owned by the Pakistani embassy. In Tehran is housed in the Swiss embassy, and the equal number of staff who just do consular services for citizens, US citizens and Iranian citizens here and there. So that's where we are. That's just a very short and quick history of where it started and where we are today. And then throughout these years, I don't want to name them, every single one of them, but I think one thing I always try to mention is that US and Iran, the grudge or the political animosity didn't just start at one point, it continues with various cycles of events. And the problem in trying to understand it is that each side has a long list of grievances of just their own. They don't acknowledge what they do to the other. You hear about Iran as this malign actor with all the bad behavior and its proxies across the region, but not so much of what the US also has done to Iran from the beginning and throughout these years. How many of you have heard that the US shot down an Iranian passenger plane during the 1980s Iran-Iraq war with, 200-something passengers flying as part of, the pressure that was being inserted back then when Iran was fighting very close U.S. ally and friend Saddam Hussein. Long list of grievances. But basically where we are right now is, I would say, this perpetual cycle of animosity that has continued. A lot of bad timing, unfortunately, because there have been many instances, and I'm happy to talk about some of them, but there have been instances of both sides in the US or in Iran coming to a point or having a partner who wants to fix it, but not at the same time. So there would be a time, for example, that you have someone on the US side who would try to reach out, but not a partner on the Iranian side, and the same goes for the Iranian side. A famous instance is when the US invaded Afghanistan, the Iranians were not fans of the Taliban, so there's this famous meeting that is always referenced where Iranians and Americans gather, and invading Afghanistan is very difficult, and fighting against Taliban, as we have now seen, proven through those mountains and all of that. And the Iranians tell the US, here, this is how you get in. And they go and they launch and they succeed. And then just a little while later, George Bush goes to the podium and calls Iran the axis of evil. And the Iranians get shocked by that. And by the way, that's also what leads to the axis of resistance, which I'm happy to talk about later. But so just to give you a bird's eye view of why we're in this perpetual cycle, because I think sometimes the why is not discussed as much. It's like, oh, inherently these two countries should hate each other and should not have relations and should be forever enemies. First of all, they weren't, not so long ago. It's not like some, natural inherent divide or just a mismatch that has to continue forever. But then also, it is a cycle that constantly and perpetually continues and just keeps, at least doesn't get worse, except for small periods of time. So I think maybe to talk a little bit about today, and then I'd love to get some feedback or questions from the room. Where we are right now, Medea, should I talk a little bit about today, Trump and Iran? Because I think we're at an interesting time right now. I see some nodding. A lot of crazy things are happening in this town and around the country. But I think there's one area which I focus and I follow, the U.S. and Iran, or Trump and Tehran, as I like to call it. I think we're at a very interesting time and potentially a watershed moment. I see a very interesting opening that may or may not be used between the two countries. But what I find interesting is that the current President Donald Trump, throughout the campaign, has showed interest in talking and negotiating and making a deal with Iran. He's been very consistent in saying that he wants a deal, he doesn't want war, he doesn't want regime change. He's been asked specifically and sharply on regime change, and he said no to that, on war, and also on the fact that he wants a deal. Now, what kind of deal is not very clear. I don't even think he exactly knows what it is. He's called it a nuclear deal, a nuclear peace deal, and then latest was a verifiable nuclear peace deal. So these are the parameters, which verifiable usually means you will have international monitoring who will then be able to verify. But that it sounds kind of like the JCPOA, the nuclear deal that was negotiated under the Obama administration, but it definitely has to have a different name. I also think Donald Trump wants a Nobel Peace Prize, really, because Barack Obama has one. And so I'm all for people doing things that would lead to a Nobel Peace Prize, peaceful things. So I think, and then also J.D. Vance, his vice president, has been very consistent in talking about diplomacy against war, and specifically asked on Iran a number of times. I don't know if you all watched the vice presidential debate, but the first question was about preemptive strikes on Iran. It's, we're kind of in one of those eras in the media, like the lead up to the Iraq War, pre-Iraq War, where the media really helped that drum of war. And I see the White House, and during the election campaign also, getting this question a lot. Are you considering preemptive strikes on Iran? When are you considering preemptive strikes? How is the preemptive strikes on Iran going to look like? And I feel like both Trump and Vance have really refused to take that bait and answer that question, or they've actually rebuffed it. And in that vice presidential debate, J.D. Vance said an infamous line that diplomacy is not a dirty word. Essentially, that it's something that they're open to. So I see an opening today. It's a very small window of opportunity. It is a window of opportunity because also, let me talk about the other side in Iran. There was a hardline president in Iran, Ebrahim Raisi, who just suddenly or mysteriously, depending on how you look at it, died in a helicopter crash. So his helicopter with his foreign minister crashed into a mountain in Iran, and he died midterm. And according to the Iranian constitution, they had to have elections within a couple of months. And so now suddenly, and coincidentally, there is a reformist president back in power, which was unexpected. He was obviously elected, and is open to negotiating and talking to the US and making deals, and he's talked about it. He brought the same team of diplomats that did the JCPOA, the nuclear deal under the Obama administration. If you don't know what the JCPOA is, I'm happy to explain, but Javad Zarif, the then foreign minister, and is now his vice president. Abbas Araghchi, who was the top negotiator then, is now his foreign minister. Majid Takht Ravanchi, Gharib Abadi. So the whole team that really helped the administration of President Rouhani, the modern President Rouhani in Iran, negotiated the deal with Barack Obama, is now back in power. And they have shown a lot of interest in sort of making that deal with Iran. Now, I say it's a small window of opportunity because of two things. One, time is short, I think, on both sides. For the hawkish hardliners in Iran who don't want this engagement and deal and diplomacy with Iran to be able to take the upper hand again, which they don't right now. And then also for the neocons here who have been somewhat weakened or are confused or disoriented in Washington, for them to also sort of be able to take back control of foreign policy and sort of have that hawkish policy across the line, which I don't think they do right now. And so the window of opportunity is small. And then also I think there isn't much focus coming from the top, which is another problem. So this sounded like it was a priority for Donald Trump during the campaign, or one of his top priorities, ending the war in Ukraine, I believe he said in 1 week, making a peace deal with Iran, and then, of course, immigration. But now I feel like if it doesn't happen, he can't focus on this, and he will be distracted, and then the priority will keep going down, and that's a threat or a risk that then this won't happen. So that's kind of where we are as far as Tehran and Washington, with a little historical view of how we got here, and where we exactly are right now. But if it's okay, I'd like to hear a little bit from the room. You all look interested, but I just want to make sure we're on the same page. Yes, please.
Yes, I would like to know what is the future of...
Can you have a close?
Oh, I'm sorry. I would like to know more about the future of Iran's leadership in the region regarding the Palestinian question, and how it is playing with what is happening with the Arab countries, if not other Arab countries, to come up with a proposal for Gaza and what's up with it.
Sure. Should I use this one? Okay. Sure. So the question, I think, was about Iran and the question of Palestine and proposals for Gaza from the Iranian perspective. Well, let me just say very quickly that you may hear about the axis of resistance or Iran's malign influence or the proxies and all. Just very quickly, it is what the axis of resistance is. Well, first of all, it's a response to the axis of evil speech. This is the famous George Bush speech 20-something years ago, when he coined a number of countries, including Iran and Syria, as the axis of evil. And this is during the war on terror. And so the response to that came that, actually from the Iranian perspective, that no, we are not the evil. You are, is what they tell the Americans, and we are the resistance to your presence across the region. And so that's when the axis of resistance was coined as a name, and it's a loose network of allies, state and non-state actors. Includes Tehran. It did include Syria until recently, not anymore. And then these non-state actors, which you've heard of, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Palestine or Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, and a group of militias in Iraq, the mobilization forces. And so essentially what they do is they resist, each in their own way and in their own view, the U.S. presence, either in their countries if there is, like Iraq, or if there isn't, in the region, and then also Israeli presence or Israeli occupation or apartheid, whatever you call it. They sort of work towards the same goal. I don't like calling them proxies because that gives you an idea that there are buttons in Tehran that they can push on and off, which certainly is not the case. These forces were not even really created by Iran. They kind of were there. I mean, the Houthis in Yemen have been there long before even axis of resistance was coined, and they each had their organic movements on the ground, each have formed for different reasons, but work towards the same goal. So at some point, Tehran decided to sort of organize and collaborate with them because of that shared goal. And yes, they do provide financial support to some or most of these groups, training to some of them. There's closer and further relationships. So the closest that Tehran is related to is Hezbollah, which they collaborate and work together very much. And then the furthest at this point, I would say, is Hamas, to the point that October 7th, we believe, and the Iranians say, and US intelligence has affirmed, that October 7th even came as a surprise to Iran. So that's how much they're not coordinated. And as far as the question of Palestine, I think there are multiple camps. So there are two major camps in Iran that, one, as they call it, the Maidan, or the field, the battlefield, which, works together and collaborates and supports that resistance, the axis of resistance to various groups. And then there's also the diplomats camp who see things from a diplomatic perspective, not from the battlefield. Sometimes they work together and overlaps, and sometimes they clash. And I think now there's this understanding that if the question of the issue of Palestine, which the Iranians have been saying can't be fixed militarily, if it is to be fixed in a diplomatic way, Iran doesn't really have a say because it's not at the table. So, obviously Israel, with its biggest supporter, the US, and then the Palestinians, if they are at the table, which they aren't always. And then mostly the Arab neighbors. Well, first of all, the ones who have borders and who do live there around, but also the Arab sort of nations as a whole. I think right now Gulf countries, the Arab countries around the Persian Gulf, they play a very important role. Saudi Arabia, and the rest of them, obviously, because of their influence, because of their power and their wealth and their closeness or allyship with the Trump administration. But then also countries like Jordan, like Egypt, who have, their stakeholders right across the border. As far as Iran, I think the debate is how much the Iranians should even comment on this or push on this. This is something they have been asking for, a ceasefire in Gaza, as part of also their tension with the U.S., and it's something that the Iranians diplomat are talking with, that they've been saying once there's a ceasefire in Gaza, that U.S.-Iran tensions can also be resolved easier and go down. At the same time, I think sort of the way October 7th was done was launched, which was horrific, has been criticized by that diplomat camp in Iran, and they've tried to distance themselves with that, or at least say that it was an independent operation the way it was, and that they were surprised by it and they didn't know. But I think it's also true, I'll wrap with this, that Iran has been weakened, or the resistance has been weakened with the killing of the leader of Hezbollah and its top commanders, Hamas, the political and the military wing. But the resistance itself is not. I mean, former Secretary of State Antony Blinken just recently admitted that Hamas has had as many recruits, if not more, after all this, 2 years of the destroying Hamas war. So it's not a very clear answer, but I think if you look at it diplomatically, when we say the question of Gaza, obviously Iran is not at the table, but Iran does have influence through the resistance on the battlefield. And also, I want to end with this caveat that we hear Iran is weak, but we've also heard that many times in this town over the past so many decades. We've heard that about Hezbollah when we thought it was finished before and before, and about the resistance. And it's just, you can't kill or destroy a movement unless you address the underlying reason, which I think hasn't been addressed.
I wanted to ask something about Russia, and that Trump now is obviously making big overtures toward Russia. Do you see that as a prelude to isolating Iran even more by bringing Russia closer to the United States and not keeping this sort of separation? It seems like Russia was the major, obviously, supporter for Iran on many levels, militarily and otherwise. But now with Trump being so close to Putin, is that relationship going to suffer?
I'm not sure. I don't honestly, Andy, I don't know what the intentions are, and I don't know if anyone can claim they do. But I don't think it's thought out that much. That's like very long strategic thinking, and I just don't see that in Washington. So I think, anyone disagree? I'm happy to hear Sam disagrees. At least by this administration, like from the top, I don't see sort of that complicated scheme of let's get close to Russia so we can destroy it. I think it's like, okay, I like Putin, so let's go talk to this guy, and then the Saudis very rich, let's talk to them. Iran, Nobel Peace Prize, let's do that. Which in a way may be good because it simplifies and then it separates the tasks when it comes to diplomacy, because Washington consensus and status quo as far as foreign policy has just been so broken and so intertwined in ways that we can't see and are just too complex and sometimes blow your mind when you find out. And so the less of that complexity, sometimes I think the easier for the task. Now, as far as Iran and Russia, it's interesting. So Iran and Russia have had a long and complicated relationship, and I would call it a strategic alliance or a marriage of convenience. That's not very natural. We hear about the Islamic Republic, these Islamist regime in Iran, and one of its closest allies is like communist Christian Russia. And it is a marriage of convenience. Iranians don't trust the Russians very much because they have betrayed them at junctures throughout recent history. Actually, this is funny. One of the most popular TV series currently being watched in Iran is about this history and how the Russians have betrayed Iran on so many, junctures. It's a very beautiful one. It's an Iranian-made TV series. It's a love story, but the Russia-Iran relation is in the backdrop of that. But I think it could actually help, because let's not forget the JCPOA, the nuclear deal under Obama, came as part of a framework of negotiations, essentially a table that was set up by what was called P5+1, which is the 5 world powers, Security Council veto members. One of them is Russia, and then of course China, plus Germany, and also Iran. So Iran at the table with world powers, and Russia played a positive role back then in helping the JCPOA come to life. Russia is Iran sees Russia as its closest, I would say, military ally. Obviously, it's a large world power. It's a Security Council veto member, which is very important. Not that the Russians have used that veto power for Iran too much, but Iran, always hopes that that's something that's important. Also goes with China. But with China, it's less military, more a trade and financial partner and supporter, but both of them as world powers and Security Council veto powers. And I think U.S. and Russia getting closer or reducing tensions doesn't necessarily have to harm that potential or opening for Iran. It could maybe even be positive. Depends on how things go. There are a lot of ifs, but I don't necessarily think it's a negative thing, and I don't necessarily think it's very related that we did hear that a lot in the Democratic circles before this regime change in Washington, that, oh, Iran is getting too close to China. Let's try to break that up and get them further from China. I don't know how the plan was for that, but it's definitely not with more economic sanctions, because that's the reason why Iran gets closer to China financially. But I think with Russia, I don't know. I want to wait and see before making any predictions, but I would say there may even be some positive there. And because was that Russia? because also I would say one of the other issues that hurt that sort of cycle of Iran and US potential diplomacy was the war in Ukraine. And how Russia became so toxic in the West, both for Europeans and for Americans, that it was hard, at least under the Democrats, and for Europeans, to even sit at the table with the Russians. And so if you had to do that sort of P5+1 framework, just sit at a table and talk about Iran, first of all, they didn't want to sit with Russia. So that was a problem. If that problem is sort of smoothened, at least, if the war in Ukraine ends, or if there's a resolution for that, which I hope there is, I think that could potentially even help Iran, or it may just be having a life of its own. It's a long answer to your question. I hope yeah. There are two questions, and then Sam, you disagreed with something. Can I hear what? We won't manhandle you out of this room, I promise.
Thank you. That's very kind.
Great to see you.
Good to see you. The thing that I disagreed with was, is there long-term planning in the U.S. government? And I think there is.
In this government, this administration?
I think that there's more continuity than differences in administrations. I think that administrations are tools by the U.S. establishment, and they fulfill various ends. So right now, Nasrallah is dead, Assad is out. I don't know if you agreed with this, but people like Mohammad Marandi, fairly prominent pro-Iranian government analyst, was full of bluster last year saying that Iran was going to hit Israel and hit Israel hard. That never happened. I heard I don't know how many speeches by John Mersheimer about how Iran had escalatory dominance. It doesn't. So I don't view the United States as being in the U.S. establishment as being in the precarious position that some people think. And I think that there's always, you made an interesting reference to the assassination, but not assassination, I shouldn't say assassination, the helicopter crash of May of the Iranian president and foreign minister, which preceded.
No, I didn't say assassination.
No, I know. Yeah. I corrected myself immediately. So, we've had a sequence of events that I think. The question that I was going to ask you was, what do you see is going on beneath the surface? That is, the part of the history between Iran and the United States that you didn't touch on was the Iran-Contra scandal, was October surprise, which is a theory, it's not established, but basically collusion between right-wing elements of the United States and right-wing elements of Iran. I think that there's always collusion between various elements, whether they're Iran or Russian or whatever, and the United States and each other. So I think that there's a lot more beneath the surface in this relationship. And going back to the first question regarding Palestine, I don't know where that leaves Palestine. Nation states act on their perceived self-interest, and they offer rhetorical support for various principles, but that may or may not be something that people of conscience can depend upon. That's kind of my perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there's a question in there.
No, that's okay. It was
yeah.
interesting. I don't necessarily disagree. It's just you provided different context, but there were also two questions or more.
Hello. Thank
Hi.
you for being here. I actually had just a question about sort of political dynamics in Iran. You mentioned after the helicopter crash where the president was killed that there's now like a reformist president. And I was wondering if you could talk more about those political differences, what it means to be a reformist in Iran. Yeah, just about contemporary political dynamics.
Sure. Great question. Um, So I would just, again, to simplify, at the expense of simplifying, divide the Iranian political structure into the more hawkish or hardline, sort of right, and the more moderates or reformists. Some people in Washington get offended even by the word reformists. I don't know why, but call them whatever you want in the Iranian context. They call themselves Islah Talab, which means reform wanting, which essentially implies that they want structural change, but not through violence. So not another revolution, basically, is the idea, but real change or reforms. It first came, that move, I would call it a movement in the 1990s. So 79 was a revolution. Immediately after the revolution, there was a lot of chaos, political chaos in the country, on the street assassinations, the embassy takeover, like a country that was trying to rebuild after a revolution. And Saddam Hussein attacked Iran, and then they fought an 8-year war right after a bloody revolution. And yes, a very deadly, bloody war on both sides also, Iran and Iraq. And long, very long. And then after that came the years of reconstruction, as it was called, Sazandegi. And just about sort of 2 decades after the revolution, in the mid-90s, and this is when I was born right after the revolution, a couple of years after the revolution. This is when my generation, the one born after the revolution, who had nothing to do with the revolution, no decision, no knowledge. Our parents just launched the revolution and handed it to us. And then grew up throughout a war. As a child, I have memories of, towards the end of the war, what was called the bombing of the cities, when they both started bombing, Saddam started bombing Tehran and other cities, and the Iranians, and with U.S. support, yes, with U.S. support, which is, again, another point of grievance on that list. And then in the mid-90s, which is when this generation, my generation, were young adults and teenagers, started this era of reform. Essentially, a new generation saying, we're done with the revolutionary, war and construction vibe. It's a very young society. There was a baby boom actually around the 1980s for that generation, and it still is fairly young. So about 70% of the population now is under the age of 40. Back then it was, around its 20s or even teenagers. And so this new president came with the idea of reform, Mohammad Khatami, President Khatami, I don't know if you've heard of him, but 1990s, and to everyone's surprise, he was elected with a landslide. I still remember 20 million was the headline of the number of votes he got. The idea was, 1, he wouldn't get votes, or 2, even if he did, they will rig it and won't let him win. And they didn't. And he won, and came the era of reform, which he started. He coined it. 2 terms, one again in another landslide. That's how reform started. And then there have been ups and downs since then. But I would say still the majority of the population, which we say majority because that's where the votes come from, right? Whoever wins has the majority of the... because no one can claim to speak for all of Iranians, and I know a lot of Iranians in the diaspora do, so I don't want to be doing that. But what we see from the polling and from these votes is that consistently the majority has wanted these reforms, has wanted better relations with the outside world, especially the West, which Iranians have been isolated from, and it has had real life consequences. Economic sanctions, U.S. economic sanctions target every major industry in the country, and has brought very little, if any, policy change, has strengthened a group of small elite that we call Kasaban Tarim, or sanctions profiteers in the country, who actually benefit from these economic sanctions. And sort of the black market that creates, there's a lot of money to be made. And it has impacted, it has hurt the lives of ordinary Iranians, middle class, working class, and the real backbone for what you would see the agents of change for democratization, better governance in a country. And so, but again, at every juncture, we see that when they have the chance, the society has the chance to speak up, they still go for that reform, which they see as the furthest from that hardline core status quo. And so Ebrahim Raisi, the previous hardline president, won because he had no viable reformist was allowed to run against him. They were all disqualified. So it was a landslide because he was kind of shooed-in with some support, but certainly not as much as the reformists did. And then the helicopter crash came, and now this reformist president, Masoud Pezeshkian, a former member of parliament, won the election, again, to many surprise, and is talking about relations or amending ties with the West, with the U.S. The talking point I like from his campaign was that we can't fight everyone. You know, we can't be fighting with everyone. We can't be fighting all of our neighbors. This is mainly, you know, Israel, of course, is implicit, but also Saudi Arabia and the other Arab neighbors. And we can't be fighting, you know, these big powers in the world. So the idea of diplomacy, of trying to amend ties, is something that's very strong. It's part of the mandate of this administration, and the team that he's brought on, of these top diplomats that Iran has ever produced, I would say, is a testament to that. But then it's not just that. It's a lot of, you know, the circumstance, and also what kind of partners you get on the other side. And to Sam's point, as far as Iran being weak, which I agree, yes, Iran and the resistance are weak. Assad, we didn't talk about Syria. So Bashar al-Assad, Iran's only Arab state ally, real ally, whose father, Hafez Assad, stood by Iran. So very quickly, just that Iran Syria history. When Saddam attacked Iran in the 1980s, right after revolution, sort of the entire Arab world, I would say, including the Palestinians, and the West supported him, or was somewhat on his side, and the only Arab state that sided with Iran was Syria. And so that this long-standing sort of loyalty that the Iranians had been showing to Assad, the history of it starts then. And then with the fall of Assad in Damascus, which I think could have a silver lining for Iran in the long term, because he was also turning more into a reliability, not so much a partner. But yes, I think the resistance is weak, but it's not done. And to your question, Sam, I think we have seen that because the talking point in Washington is simultaneously that Iran is this malign actor that everyone has to mobilize and, you know, fight against. But then at the same time, it's a bug that you can crush. And sometimes I'm like, okay, then which is it? Is it really that malign and big that you have to mobilize all this resource and, you know, power and everything, the whole world to fight it? Or is it like so easy to contain or take care of that you don't have to worry about it? So I don't think it's either. I think it's somewhere in between. Iran is a middle power. It's not a global power, but it's definitely a regional power. And with this network of alliances and partners that it has, it certainly has a lot of ways of creating headaches for the U.S. and its allies, as we've seen in the past year. But, you know, that sort of comes in waves and has ups and downs. So, yeah. Let's go to the next person who's been waiting.
Next? Okay. Thank you again for this very informative lecture about I think in this country, definitely a criminally understudied topic of Iran. I mean, I don't think, you know, most students in this country are going to learn anything in high schools or probably even universities unless they take a specialized program on Iran and its history. I was wondering what you see as far as like the future of Iran, you know, post, do you see I mean, I don't know if anybody can really predict this exactly, but I'm sure there's been lots of theories or predictions like a post-revolutionary government Iran, right? So if in the future, I mean, the government's been in power now for 45 years, right? So has anybody seen like what happens after this government? What is it being replaced by? Will it be replaced by chaos? Will it be replaced by something that resembles like in Turkey? Because as someone who lived in Turkey, I think that Iran has the potential to be as economically powerful as Turkey with that very young population you mentioned, like millions of young people studying technical fields or STEM fields. I mean, again, I think it could really compete with Turkey in the region, if not globally. So what do you envision as the future of a post Islamic revolutionary government? And do you see somebody like Trump visiting Tehran to have like an opening like Nixon did with China? Can you see Trump actually visiting Tehran and making a deal in Tehran?
Thank you. What did you call it? Criminally understudied. I like that. I think I'm going to use that. Criminally understudied. And why? Because I think, again, as I said at the beginning, there is so much, invested in foreign policy on that country, yet so little known about it. And I think, yes, that's criminal. How can you have so much interest with so little knowledge? Either ignore it or understand it, yes. As far as post-revolution, are you talking about regime change? I'm just not very clear. How is that? Because I don't see the process of that happening on its own, but at the same time, I feel like it's transforming into a post-revolutionary system. That's actually one of the internal debates that Iranians have within the camps themselves, and it's been said from the outside of how long can the system be a revolutionary, because they used to call it themselves the revolution. Like that was a source of pride right after the revolution, that we are a revolutionary government. We are revolutionaries. You're not a technocrat. You're someone who was in the revolution for a little bit. And then the war came, so they were the war commanders. So for years after the war, the virtue and the value of serving in any public sort of role was to be either a revolutionary or a war veteran. And now, after 30, 40 years, 4.5 decades after that, there's this debate and this question of how long are we going to cling to that? When is that revolutionary period done? I think it already is. And when are we going to transform into a real state and a real society that's done and, passed or moved on from a revolution and a war, which means it's fairly stable. If you think you're done with that revolutionary period, you don't see another one coming. And then transforming into a real technocracy or a real, structure of governance. So that debate exists. As far as post, this, I just don't see a prospect for a sudden form of regime change. But as far as the system transforming itself, I would say the reformists, as I just talked about it, that is the idea. So without another revolution, without a civil war, without a lot of blood being shed, how do we transform this system into something that the hardliners actually argue is going to look so different that it would amount to regime change without regime change? That's why the hardliners actually hate the reformists so much, because they're like, these guys actually want a revolution without doing a revolution. And so that's the idea, that it has to look very different, but it shouldn't come through, if it's internal, what is it? It's
So do you see something like that in Iran is kind of like, you know, what I was saying, and then again with Trump and the deal?
It's hard, you know, I don't like to predict, but I don't see any prospect for that. And there has been sort of that line pushed, especially in DC for the past 4 decades. That's why I want to be more careful. It's like this regime is its last foot. And there's also no accountability, because sometimes they even give you a timeline, like this is it, this is the revolution, this is the regime change. And you're like, you said that 20 years ago, and you keep saying it, and you know, how exactly or when? So just to give you a very recent reference, 2022 September, the Women Life Freedom Movement, which came after a young woman died in the custody of the morality police, and you probably heard of the women protests across Iran, which I called revolutionary, and it did bring a cultural revolution in the country. The Iranian society, as far as you know, the hijab and the mandatory dress code, looks nothing like it did before September. Like, it really divided recent history into before September 2022 and after. But then you had all these pundits and analysts calling it an actual revolution. And then I did many interviews, including one on CNN a year later, and the anchor asked me, was like, what happened to the revolution? I was like, I don't know. I never called it a revolution. It wasn't a political revolution with the imminent fall of the regime. How will the protesters be? Yes, there were very radical slogans against the regime, but you can't bring down a system with just slogans. If you can't even occupy a police station, how can you bring down a system that has a monopoly on arms, on violence, and has a lot of support? You know, that's the other thing. There is sort of this notion in DC, in some Western capitals, that it's a kleptocracy of just a group of clergies or mullahs who are running the country with absolutely zero support. Sometimes they even call them foreigners invading the country, and that's not true. The support is not massive. The core support is small, but there is a support. There is a support, and there's diehard support. There is a number of a few million supporters who I would say would be willing to go on the street and die for this regime, fight for this regime. And then the rest of the society also, I want to mention, doesn't support change to the extent that they would have to go on the street and die for it. That's the other thing. You hear from the outside voices usually saying, why isn't the middle class fighting against the regime? Well, the middle class wants a better life without having to die for it. And that's very understandable. That's why it's called reform. I have middle class, you know, urban middle class, educated, not so young, like my age friends that I'm in touch with, friends and sources on the ground all the time. And you ask them, you're like, how come, you know, the protests didn't get as big as in millions? And the answer is very simple. It's like, well, because they're shooting at people. I don't want to die. I don't want to lose an eye. I don't want to lose a leg. I want a better life. I want, you know, more freedom for my dress code. And I'm not willing. Some do, and it's very brave and it's noble, but it's not as big as in millions. So I think this is actually a value, a virtue that the society, I would call it, so mature that is done with that bloody revolutionary, you know, mindset and the war that came after. And they're like, we just want reforms, but also peace. So a better life, but through, you know, a conciliatory way. Because if you're constantly thinking of reversing what exists, that's also how civil war starts. So I think we experience that. And this is also another thing people, I think, don't always realize, is that when you had it, revolutions don't come often. It's a very, very big event. And this is a society that had a revolution. We may think it was a long time ago, but it wasn't so long, because the people who did the revolution are still alive. The people who grew up through a war are still alive, and it wasn't fun. And so not wanting that again, I think, comes from a point of strength and maturity. Like, I don't want bombs on my city anymore, so let's try to not fight everyone. Or I don't want a lot of people to die on the streets, so let's try to bring change in a peaceful way and not having to kill your neighbor who thinks differently than you. Yeah. There's more questions.
Hi. Thanks for talking to us this morning.
Thank you for coming.
I have a two-part question. The first part is, how ambitious do you think Pezeshkian's objectives are when it comes to softening relations with the West? On one end, you could imagine it's just a stance that was vocalized of, we can't fight everybody, so let's calm things down a little. And on the other end, you could imagine a desire for a more long-term productive relationship. I'm curious where you think he falls in that spectrum. And then the second part would be, if he's farther on the more ambitious side of the spectrum, understanding that he has to balance various constituencies and handle grievances from the past, what signals do you think the U.S. should be looking for and to indicate that he's actually interested in a more ambitious long-term fixing of the relationship? Thanks.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Did you turn this off? Is it still working? Oh, okay. I think the ambition is very strong. He really comes from, and when we say reformist, he's a doctor, a surgeon. He was a health minister under the administration of President Khatami. So he really was within that first reform government. And since then, he's been a member of parliament 5 terms, I believe, again, as a reformist or a moderate. He doesn't associate so much with the reformist parties, the political parties, but from that sort of moderate background. But one thing I want to add as far as context with not fighting is that he also has that exact talking point in view domestically, which is interesting. So he says, I'm not here to fight everyone on the inside also, meaning these different factions. Because one thing that I think has been sort of a criticism at the reformists was that they came with too much of this infighting of the other factions, that sometimes it wasn't productive. And I think Pezeshkian's idea of we can't fight everyone on the outside, also we can't fight everyone on the inside, is sort of a testament to that I'm here with a view on cooperating, or at least hearing out the other side. What is it that this sort of more hardline hawkish side is saying? It's not just a bunch of crazy. Like what is that thinking? What is the logic? What is the necessity or the foundation of that side? Because I would say the more hawkish hardline side is not the popular side, but it's the more powerful side. What is it that gives them so much power? What's the source of power? What's that a sort of monopoly that they have? And how do we negotiate with that power? First by acknowledging it, but also negotiating to be able to bring change in real and long and meaningful ways. So you would have to have the support. You can't just do it with the diplomats. You would have to have that support of the core. We call them, in Farsi, we call them haste sakht qudrat, which is the strong core of power, which is the more militaristic, less elected core of essentially the deep state, who hold a lot of power and move much harder than, let's say, the presidency or the parliament, the elected side. So how do you negotiate with that, and how do you try to bring that core of the power to your side, but then also go out and try to amend or try to fix? And I think the other idea that I like, or is new from the Pezeshkian administration, is that it's not just looking to the West. So reformists in the past, or moderates, had been, they tended to look too much to the West. Let's just go and fix everything with the West. But now there's this understanding that, okay, it's not just going to be the West, meaning the US and Europe, but we can't lose our Eastern allies. We just need to balance it in a way that, to Annie's question, our relations with Russia is going to be beneficial but not hurting us. Same goes with China, but that also doesn't jeopardize how we're trying to amend with, the Europeans or the U.S. And then I would say also regionally, one thing that we're seeing, which is fairly new and positive, is the detente with Saudi Arabia, the Iran-Saudi detente, which came under actually administration, former hardline president Raisi. Iran and Saudi made a deal, and it still stands. And Pezeshkian praised that on the campaign trail, as much as everyone was criticizing the former president, and mostly Pezeshkian, who comes from the opposite camp. He did praise that as a diplomatic and a positive achievement, and it's still standing. So I think that also speaks to the fact of how not being able to fight all of our neighbors, and the most powerful one, obviously, without thinking about Israel, but in Arab neighbors is Saudi. That is going to also have a positive role now with this U.S. and Iran triangle. So the Saudis under Obama were a very strong opposing force to the talks and the nuclear deal. The Saudis, the Emiratis, at least privately, they actually tried to sabotage the talks or the nuclear talks. They were against it. They were critical of it. They were afraid of it, of the U.S. and Iran getting close. This time, they're not playing that role. And just recently, they actually volunteered or suggested that they can help mediate talks between Iran and the U.S., which I actually am starting to think of them as maybe a good candidate for mediation. So I think there are all of these new dynamics, and this is also to your question, speaks to sort of the trajectory that the country is going down the path of, distancing or moving on from that revolutionary governance and thinking, the post-war, and into a more, what many call it, I don't like this term, but they call it a normal state or a normal governance. Who cares about, the actual everyday lives and needs of the people, as opposed to what happened in the revolution, what are the grievances, and how do we fight the enemy, and yes.
So you kind of already started to answer what I was going to ask, which was relationships of Iran with the other Arab states. Because if you could just go into the background, because as you rightly said, because of 53 and because of the hostages in 79, the Iran-Contra, and then the stuff in 2022, the other thing that's always held up to Americans is why Iran is so bad is, see, all of the neighboring states hate them. None of them, Israel and everybody's against them. So, so could you kind of give a brief background like you did with why America and Iran now are, what is the situation? What caused this sort of, for Saudi and the other Gulf states, to oppose the deal, and why have they always, Iran is their biggest threat? In what way is it?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think it's a great question, and I like your framing. And first of all, I would answer to that I would say the most, and maybe Sam can speak to this too, or challenge me, a lot of that neighborhood also hates the U.S. and its presence. So if we go by who hates who, as far as, who's doing right and wrong, we have the Arab autocrats who are mostly U.S. allies, but then we have the Arab street who, just judging by the protests, in some of those Arab ally countries, protesting for Palestine had to actually be shut down physically and by force because of how popular it is. So I would say Iran-Arab relations, it's complicated and it's not just one-dimensional. The Arab world in itself is like, it's meaningless because there isn't really one Arab world. But I would say, well, first came the revolution, which as part of that, there was this rhetoric or talking point by the revolutionaries and also the leaders that the emancipation that happened in Iran, as they framed it, is something that needs to happen across the region with the other monarchs, the other brutal, autocratic, one-man shows that are happening in Israel. And that was a source of fear. Which king wants to be overthrown and not be king anymore, So that's understandable. Then came the Iran-Iraq war. Saddam former U.S. best friend, and then we know what happened to him, attacked Iran. And as part of that, the continuation of that talking point, and I'm just simplifying that fear sort of, the majority of the Arab world allied with him or supported him one way or the other. And except for Syria. This is what Assad in Syria. And each for their own reasons, it's not really, that's why I say it's complicated. And so that also added to this notion for the Iranians that, okay, we can't rely on this neighborhood as having a lot of allies or supporters. But then at the same time, I would say, if we look at the resistance, what is the resistance? These are non-state actors, also all Arabs in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Palestine. So if we just go by the rulers of the countries, there's one landscape. You can map it one way. If we go by the non-state actors or by popular support, so it's very complex, and I wouldn't say it's one layered, but it's certainly very simplified in DC and used as that attack line. Oh, look, everyone hates them in the region. It's not true. And the same can be said for the US or Israel or a lot of these other ones. But I would say, just to go back to that point about Saudi Arabia, I think the Iranians have started to realize that they need better neighbors or better relations with their neighbors. The Saudi detente is a big testament to that. The diplomatic corps has been very active, going to all these Arab capitals. Even after the fall of Assad, we see that they're trying to amend with Syria, with the new HTS government in Syria. It's still, they're being careful, but after the US invasion of Iraq, they try to amend with what came after. Iran has a lot of influence in Iraq, again, part of the Arab world, a big and important part of the Arab world. So I think the way it's simplified in DC, and it's ironic because the same is done in Iran. It's like everyone hates these Americans in this region, and both can actually be true. Like you can have a perspective and imagine that your enemy is being hated in the neighborhood, and it can be true. But yeah, so I think they've realized that they need to amend these relations, especially with the bigger powers. And also, I think with that resistance, the axis, we see a transformation. So they realize that, for example, with Hezbollah, it can't just be a militia, underground guerrilla movement. It has to go into government. It has to build schools. It has to run for elections. It has to have popular support. And this is something, the policy that has been sort of pushed and supported by Tehran as well. Same goes in Iraq, which, the other side hates it when these guerrilla underground fighters that you can just call terrorists and drone and eliminate suddenly are, in the parliament, in the government. They're your local technocrats. They are your, providing social services, and they have popular support. And so I feel like that moving into that direction is also, again, a testament to how they're trying to be a more post-revolutionary, post-war country, managing these relationships. And that's also why I would say Hamas and the Houthis are the furthest, because they operate as the furthest or most different from that, for example, Hezbollah and the Iraqis. I hope that was a long answer.
What do you think is Iran's desire for its relationship with Israel?
Oh, is that your question too? Okay. That's the tough one. So also, let me just give a quick background that Iran and Israel, as much as, again, it's simplified into an Arab-Israeli fight, and then Jewish-Muslim fight, and then somehow Shia-Jewish fight. I don't think any of that is very deep. Iran and Israel used to be very close allies just before the revolution. So this is, again, not a very long time ago. People are still alive who remember that history. But that also was part of the reason of where they are today. So there was very close collaboration between the Shah and Israel. Mossad trained the intelligence service, or at least the revolutionaries believed that they had a very strong role in the crackdown of the popular dissent, of the political prisoners, of how to do intelligence, how to be notorious, how to do torture, how to do this and that. And obviously Israel was close to the U.S., so Iran, U.S., Israel, and I would say politically, that's why even the non-religious, non-Islamist leftists, for example, factions that supported the revolution, this was believed across the board that our enemy is the U.S. and it's also its ally Israel, or Shah's ally Israel. But then I think after the revolution, other things were added. You know, if it's an emancipation and a resistance against by the populace against, you know, these big powers, well, your own monarchs in your country, but then the big powers who prop them up and support them, then it's the U.S. and who is its closest ally in the region? It's Israel. And then also the issue, the question of the issue of the Palestinians, you know, as a popular movement, a resistance that's fighting against something bigger, resonated with the story of the revolutionaries, and it's just been adopted. And interestingly, it came from the leftist movement, but it sort of became a pillar of the revolution because it fit perfectly with that, okay, anti-American, anti-Israel for different reasons, but then also pro-Palestinian because this is also a resistance movement. And then the attack, the Saddam's attack and the Arab world kind of helped that. And then the axis of resistance, which is also, I want to talk about this quickly, the strategic part of that. The axis of resistance is Iran's sort of defense mechanism or unconventional system, what they call it for defense or a strategic depth of a country. You have to realize that has these powerful enemies, the U.S. and Israel, with nuclear warheads and very strong, advanced, powerful armies on one side, and the Iranians with completely unmatched capacities on the other. So if Iran and Israel were to go to war just using their armies or the U.S., Iranians would lose in a minute. But that network of supporters is what they call their forward defense, their strategic depth. This is the way, going back to your question, Sam, also, that they think that they could create headaches across their. So you hit us, your base in Iraq is going to suddenly get hit by Iraqi militias who have their own reasons and grievances, which match with ours. So with having said all of that, and then again, this is to the point about grievances we don't hear as much, is how Israel also perpetuates this. So the understanding, I think, in Washington sometimes is that, you know, Israel is just being Israel and it's this threat from Iran and it's not mutual. But from the Iranian perspective, it's very mutual, it's very double-sided, and it's a big source of fear because of this sort of unmatched military capacity that I talked about. But having said that, to end this on a slightly more positive note, I would say there has been this realization over the years, again, moving from that revolutionary rhetoric, moving from the post-war rhetoric. Iranian officials wouldn't even say the word Israel. They wouldn't even acknowledge in rhetoric the name of the country. They would call it the Zionist regime, the child-killing regime, the terrorist land-grabbing regime, the regime. Now you listen to Iranian officials, at least on the world stage or in English, you hear the word Israel. As in, you know, the country that was mandated at least by the UN back in. Yeah. Well, on the street. So I would say there's this realization or this maturity or understanding or acknowledgement that, okay, this is a regional power, Israel, that we have to live with. That we may not like, we may resist, but having it be wiped off the face of the earth and all of those slogans is just not very realistic. And I think, or I hope that realization is also coming in Israel, because I don't think any of the two sides can completely obliterate or destroy each other. And so understanding that, okay, you have to come to terms. You may not like the way it is, but you have to acknowledge and live with it, I think is something that I'm seeing in the Iranian political structure, even on the hardline side. Even on the hardline side, you know, now the question of what do the Palestinians want? We see that rhetoric even from the supreme leader saying it's up to the Palestinians, which means, you know, if they want to take whatever they want, who are we to say? That wasn't the rhetoric, you know, 2 or 3 decades ago. It was all wipe it off the face of the map. But now it's, the word referendum is being used a lot, which, you know, is a basically democratically deciding for the people who live there what the Palestinians want, and Iran sort of taking a back seat, back to your question of if they're not directly at the table and the Palestinians are, who are they to decide? So yeah, I think it's a very long trajectory. I don't see the embassies reopening anytime soon, but I think maybe moving in a positive direction. And then obviously things have to change on the Israeli side. I mean, we have to acknowledge it's an illegal occupation now. Human rights organizations calling it apartheid, the UN. And that's just not sustainable. I mean, as long as you have that, you will have resistance, regardless of whether Iran is there or not and who runs it. I don't think, sadly, I think there's this sort of perspective being pushed that somehow this all has to do with Iran. I'm like, it has nothing to do with Iran. They're just riding the wave, if you want to look at it in an opportunistic way or in a more, a deeper way. This wave will exist no matter what. So that question and that issue has to be dealt with. And I think once it is, then the issue with Iran will be easier to resolve or smoother also. So your question was the same question? Okay. Yes. You are? You're not. It will take a very long time, but I mean, I'm seeing signs that we may be on a better trajectory. Of both sides acknowledging at least the fact that they're not going away, I would say. Neither is completely going away, because I think that was the wish and the hope by either, that like they'll just go away.
Any government in Iran today that could bring an agreement between the United States and sanctions would be as powerful, I think, as any power in Iran. If we were to have peace and drop all sanctions, that group would be very powerful.
And popular, yes.
Very popular.
Thank you very much. Fantastic talk. Actually, you know, I'm really impressed by how much the current regime has achieved with regards to social indicators like health, education, actually much better than other countries in the region. They have the lowest fertility rate. How do you explain this? It's a conservative government that has achieved very progressive results in those indicators.
So maybe it isn't as conservative as it seems. Do you work in health?
I do.
Yeah, so this may be very detailed, and I don't want to get too detailed, but I've just out of interest followed this a lot. So for family planning, for example, the government had these very, very successful family planning programs launched across the country that became basically models for WHO, World Health Organization, that are being, you know, taught across the region with other states. And how do you reconcile that? Exactly. It's shocking. How can a conservative, religious, you know, bunch of zealots push family planning to the point that I remember growing up, there was this state-coined slogan and advertisement paid by the state. You would see on television, you would see in highways across town that would say, 2 is good for kids. 2 is good. No, sorry. 1 is good. 2 is enough. And the birth rate went from my parents' generation, so both of my parents are children of a family of 7 and 6 children, with 6 being 8. 2 of them died of a lack of vaccine. This is 80 years ago. To now a generation that I just have 1 sibling. Went from about 7, 8 kids to 2. And now my generation have 0 or 1. That's like the norm, at least in big cities. It's a little too much. So now they're trying to reverse action. The state is actually trying to sort of be like, 1 is good, 2 is better. But so this goes, just to give you a bird's eye view, this goes to the fact that we are wrong to think that the government has no support, no local grounding, no organic, life of its own, and it's a bunch of mullahs who came from like some other planet and are invading the country. Really, that is a talking point, that they're invading our country and they have nothing to do with us. But post-revolution, I would say what happened is that a very large demographic of rural, religious, traditional, lower, not middle class. So the urban middle class had it really well. This is my family. The secular urban middle class, the educated elite, they had excellent jobs. They tell you how their salary was in US dollars. This is one of the things people say. Before the revolution, I used to make $1,000 a month as an engineer in Tehran. This is 1979. That was a lot of money. And now my salary amounts to like $1, if not a month. So that you see the change. So the urban middle class secular community who wanted to live a Western life, who we see in all those photos at the beaches, at the swimming pools, and the universities, had it really well, economically, socially, not politically. But then there was a large demographic of rural, religious, conservative, people who lived in a different way, that were neglected, that were falling behind, that had no, matching sort of quality of life to that urban elite, which that system really worked for. And what the revolution did is that it kind of reversed it. So it uplifted the more rural or the more conservative or the more religious, and it pushed down the urban elite. They were purged from jobs, from universities, the secular urban elite. But then instead, there were policies, very interesting, for example, there were policies that really worked for that religious or traditional class. For example, I'll tell you one. Separating girls and boys in universities sounded like a crazy idea to the urban secular elite, but it actually helped the religious and more traditional class trust the system more and allow their girls to even go to university. And then you see an uptick to the point that about a decade, or I think over a decade ago, it flipped, and over 60% of university students were women across Iran, looking at the whole of the society. And the same goes with health. The state launched a lot of sort of these, I would say, socialist or very, populist programs, as you said, social programs, health programs, education. They literally call it the education, an education campaign, a nehzat, which is almost like a movement, an education movement, or like a war that was launched for rural areas, for disadvantaged, for people who didn't have that access before. Health programs, again, the vaccination. There was a very successful vaccination program that literally went door to door because it studied those rural areas and was like, okay, what is the problem? The vaccine is not there. People are not getting it. So let's bring it to them. They would hire local trusted workers from the community, which wasn't happening before. Local leaders, community leaders from the community who people trusted would go door to door and tell people, this is what your child needs. to not die like your other child did 30 years ago. And that's how vaccination, for example, worked. Family planning. Ironically, they used the support in some instances of religious leaders, local religious leaders who would promote family planning in religious ceremonies, like before prayer. Before the prayer, the imam would have a speech where you talk about ethics and virtue, and this would be one of it, like how do you do family planning? So I think just to bring it to that big picture and not get too focused, I think it's that idea that this state has no support, no understanding of the society, and so these things would come to us as a shock. And these are examples that would prove the opposite.
So I want to see how many more questions we have left.
I'm happy to stay a little longer if there's
Okay, well, I will do a question. I'm trying to see the array of forces in favor of cooperation with Iran at this moment, because I feel like, you know, that this administration is really going in so many different directions, and you hear different speeches and different things. On the one hand, this administration about maximum pressure on Iran, and you see the influence of the APAC and the Iranian diaspora in this country, and the fourth, and the war hawks. And on the other hand, I'm not sure, you know, who are the forces that are for cooperation, because Democrats seem out of the picture. I don't see them doing anything on Iran. There are some Republicans who seem to be saying, let's focus our energies on China and not get bogged down in the Middle East. And yet in other places, like in Venezuela, I see its business community, Chevron, you know, let's lift the sanctions so we can work there. The Russians talking to Trump about, if we lift the sanctions, there will be $300 billion worth of business that you could be doing. Are there business interests in this country that could or should or are involved? And what other forces can we work with to improve relations and get sanctions lifted?
So because of everything that we discussed as far as this country's status quo or foreign policy against Iran, unfortunately there aren't many forces in this town within the Beltway who want to amend. This is within both parties. And as you said, Medea, this administration is not a monolith. It's very confusing, even within the departments, right? So we're seeing these, I don't want to call them doves, but these realists, as they call them, or restrained order, essentially the forces that are against war for different reasons, like why should we even care, or why should we even spend this much money? Why do we need to be in the Middle East, which I agree with? Going, for example, into Pentagon, but not so many in the State Department, which again, I don't think is as systematic, maybe more rather like who was available to do the transition, and so they brought their own people, and so that one group went here and the other there. But I think the most important force, and this is what gives me a lot of hope, who wants it, is the president himself. So there are a lot of bad cops in town, but the one who really wants the deal, I think, is Trump himself. He has been consistent in saying that he wants a deal with Iran, and that this nuclear peace deal, and that he doesn't want war, as I discussed at the beginning, and he doesn't want regime change. So if you don't want regime change, which means no boots on the ground, Afghanistan, Iraq style, we saw how that worked out. If you don't want another endless war in the Middle East, which war with Iran will be endless, it will be much worse than Iraq. It's a bigger country, stronger central government, and all of that. If you don't want that, and you don't want that, and he's also said no to strikes on Iran's nuclear sites, which is something the Israelis have put in front of him and AIPAC is pushing for, then diplomacy is the only way left. But the big question, which I think is as big as the intent, is the process. How? You want a deal, okay, but how? Who is the Iran envoy? There isn't. So who will go sit at the table? Who will make the phone call? Who will put pen to paper? You know, is it going to be sort of the Trump Kim Jong-un handshake photo op, which seems to be the idea of deal making and negotiations, or is there actually going to be a process? So I think that's why I call it a very small window of opportunity. It's one thing if you say you want a nuclear deal, but then also like a couple weeks later, you go and sign the maximum pressure memorandum. So if I don't know if you know, but Trump signed a maximum pressure memorandum, which, to put into context, maximum pressure, meaning maximum sanctions, was the policy of his first administration, which the Biden administration didn't really end, and they didn't really reverse. So the memorandum was really just a reminder that this is still there, but in reality, it will tighten sanctions maybe a little more, but it's not a whole new policy. But this is also his way of, you know, trying to get to the table through strength or through pressure. Oh, I'm going to pressure them a little more and see if they come to the table, which is something he tried the first term and then it failed. Remember the first term also, the first Trump term, he was first talking about doing a better nuclear deal. He didn't come and say, I want to assassinate their top general. At the beginning, it was all about how this is a bad deal, no business for America in this deal, the nuclear deal, and that I'm going to make a better deal. But then the process was wrong, and it went to, I'm going to pull out of this deal, I didn't get a better deal, and then I'm going to assassinate their general, bring the two countries to the brink of war. That war almost happened. This is 2020. And now we're here. So I think the second time, there are more elements there. So J.D. Vance himself and the people who he's bringing from that world of realists or restraint ordered. But and there's a partner on the Iranian side, which is the reformist president, and that whole JCPOA team, who is the best partner you can have as far as being able to deliver. But the process hasn't started. And what I'm worried about right now at this moment, is that each side thinks or pretends like the ball is on the other side. The other side has to make the first move. I've said that I want a deal. The Iranians too. Now they have to make the first move. And that's also dangerous, because you may want to negotiate, but then, yeah.
We have the last.
So the narrative going around is that Bibi and his genocide crew will attack Iran without any, knowledge of the United States, even though they couldn't last a minute without our equipment. So why wouldn't Trump, who's now negotiating whatever he's doing in Ukraine, go for the grand slam, get a piece, his own JPCOA, the Trumpy JPCOA, which you already have a blueprint for? How do you think the Democrats, and then I don't think Iran would ever sign a JPCOA today without some kind of permanent ceasefire in Palestine. I don't think you'd ever reach an agreement, because let's acknowledge one thing: Iran is on the right side of history right now in the Palestine, the Zionist state conflict, war, whatever you want to call it. Do you see the Democrats going along with a JPCOA? It's already, the blueprint's there.
I think so. I'm hopeful. Again, that's why I'm saying it's a unique window of opportunity, that if a deal is made, which would put them on the trajectory away from a war, right? Because you either go down the path of conflict, and you have the cycles, and eventually you get the war. Either you start it or Bibi starts and then pulls you into it. Or you move away from that, which would be diplomacy and deals. And it would have to include sanctions relief and Iran rolling back its nuclear program and all of that, which was essentially the JCPOA. That's what it was. The JCPOA was Iran and world powers negotiating, Iran agreeing to roll back its nuclear program, allow international monitoring, the UN, IAEA, whatever, to go into the country, put up cameras, look at everything, make sure this remains a civilian program, which to this day it still is, as US intelligence has said, in exchange for sanctions relief. And then the U.S. pulled out of that deal, basically, to simplify. They reneged while Iran was complying, and the Iranians were like, okay, then we don't need the cameras, the monitoring, we're going to ramp up this program and get as close to a weapons program without actually crossing the threshold, which will then trigger something else. It's still a civilian program, but it's on the verge of what they call a threshold state, a state that has enough material to potentially build a bomb if they want to, if they get, for example, attacked. So that's the idea. The decision making, the policy is that we don't want a nuclear weapon, but maybe we do one day. What if the homeland is attacked? What if we get invaded? And so the calculations can change. And that's one of the public debates. As far as the question of Israel, as much as we know and understand from the reporting behind the scenes, is that I agree with you, that's what Bibi wants. And he's done a lot of crazy, but I don't think he's gone suicidal yet. So both times, the instances in past April and in October, when we had the back and forth between Israel and Iran, retaliate, and then stop, the Biden administration, to their credit, actually, I will give them credit here, told the Israelis that we will be with you in defense, but not in offense. Don't count on us on trying to attack Iran with you, and they didn't. And I think that's what stopped it short of the one-on-one. And so far, that's what we're hearing coming from the White House. They didn't give him a green light as far as attacking Iran, and that we will be with you if you do it, in the attack, in the offense. Now, would he be able to concoct something, and I'm sure that's at least the thinking of how to do it without U.S. green lighting, but then make sure they get pulled in? I don't know. I think the Iranians have also shown a lot of restraint. It could have escalated with Israel. Every time they retaliated, they made it very clear in rhetoric and also in action that this is a one-off, with as minimal as possible, just showing strength and projecting power, but we don't want this to escalate, and we don't want the U.S. to get pulled in. And I think the good thing here is that regardless of whichever administration, there's no appetite for war in the American society. And the winner of this election here in the U.S. got that. Unfortunately, the Democrats didn't. They became the party of war. They became the party who didn't realize that the populace doesn't want war. They are the ones who framed it as, oh, even if we don't give Bibi the weapons, he will still continue. But how? How will he continue a war if he doesn't have the 2,000-pound bombs to drop on children? So I think it's not because this Democratic administration is naturally against war. It's because the American public is sick of these endless wars and the money that's being thrown in them. And so there has to be a solution that's moving away from that. Now, will that happen? I don't know. I don't want to make predictions or promise, because the process is as important as the intent. But so far, we're hearing that Bibi and the war cabinet, they've been pushing for U.S. support the past year almost to go in. Well, the ideal scenario for them is not Israel doing it, but Iran doing it, but the U.S. doing it. The U.S. attacking Iran nuclear sites, which the U.S. hasn't done and seems to not be interested in, and Trump has publicly stated that, and Biden actually too, that they're not going to go for Iranian nuclear sites. And then the second, I think, best scenario for them is that they started, but then the U.S. have some kind of guarantee that the U.S. will follow right away. And we haven't heard that. It's not, they didn't tell them no, as far as I know, but they didn't say we will join you or we will support you. So, but that plan is still there, and the proposal is on there, and it's a real danger, yes.
So we want to give a big round of applause to Negar for a fabulous talk. This was really wonderful. Thank you, Andy and Busboys, for giving us this venue. And we have a sign-up sheet that if you're not on it, if you're already on it, don't worry about it. I know some of you are regulars, but if you're new here, please sign up. And this is a way for us to stay in touch. I just want to give a plug for Negar's podcast called the Iran Podcast, just to give you a taste of the kind of things she covers. Can Europe and Iran improve relations? Israel, Lebanon, and Iran Diplomacy is not a dirty word, Iran-Gulf relations. She has great guests on her show, so please sign up and be a supporter of Iran Podcast. And also, I do want to say that I'm maybe not as optimistic as you are, and I'm glad to hear your optimism. I just have a terrible fear about Israel always pushing for another distraction for what it's doing, and doing something horrific by going after Iran's nuclear facilities could be one of them.
I share your fear.
Okay,
I share
okay.
the fear. I've
So
just
in
seen the
that
positive
spirit,
side.
I would say support organizations that are working to improve relations, like National Iranian American Council. And Code Pink for a long time has been doing work on Iran. So if you go online and become members of our organization, supporters, I think it is important. And those of us who go around in Congress, when there are issues that we can support around Iran, we add that into our work as well. So let's not just rely on the anti-war sentiments of the American public, which I think you're right is very strong. But we also need organizational push, and especially to be pushing the people in Congress in both parties who benefit, unfortunately, from war. So once again, thanks to Negar, thanks to Andy for Busboys. Thank you all for coming to this. We will be sending out an announcement for our, what is next Sunday?
Next Sunday is on Islam.
On Islam. And who do we have?
Yeah, it's with Nader Hashemi is next week on Islam, and the topic is around politics and Islam and how it plays into. Yep, he's a very good expert on the subject. He's a professor at Georgetown University.
One of the best. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for spending your Sunday morning studying, understanding Iran and discussing, and to media for the invitation, Andy for hosting, and yes, good luck to the rest of this weekly.